Hi, everyone. Today I'll be reviewing what's known as the convergence hypothesis, which is an important idea in environmental philosophy, and in particular when it comes to the ethics of policy decisions. Um, so basically, the hypothesis predicts that in the long run, the interests of non-human nature and the interests of human beings will tend to converge. They'll tend to overlap and be very similar. Uh, so what this means is that whether you're what's called an anthropocentrist or whether you're a non-anthropocentrist, I'll explain those terms in a minute, whichever of those views you adopt, uh, the right policy that you ought to take when it comes to environmental issues will tend to be the same or very similar. And the reason for that is that anthropocentrists, by definition, are people who think that only human beings have moral standing, whereas non anthropocentrists are people who think that some non humans, maybe many, but at least some, um, also have moral standing. So, moral standing is a term in ethical theory that refers to the fact that some entity deserves moral consideration. This moral consideration can take many forms. For example, it might come in the form of having rights. So you might say, for example, non-human animals have certain rights, maybe rights not to be subjected to extreme pain for arbitrary reasons, maybe a right to life. That's one possibility. You might not believe in non-human rights and, for example, be a utilitarian who thinks that the well-being of non-human animals matters for its own sake and ought to be taken into account when we're trying to determine which actions will produce the best consequences in terms of overall utility. Um, but when it comes to environmental thought, many philosophers want to extend moral standing beyond not just human beings, but beyond non-human animals as well. Um, so one view, known as biocentrism, is the idea that all living things have moral standing. Um, that would include non-human animals, of course, but it would also include plant life. It would include microorganisms, fungi, anything that's living. And of course, there are many debates about whether such entities can have moral standing, and that's an issue that we can address at a different time. But if you do think that, say, trees have moral standing, then that means you think that those trees deserve to be considered in our deliberations of what the morally right thing to do is. So if a tree didn't have moral standing, then you could just cut it down without worrying about doing anything wrong to the tree itself. But if you think it does have moral standing, then it's possibly a morally questionable act to cut down the tree. Maybe it's still permissible, but you at least have to think about maybe what's good for the tree or what's actually right with respect to that non-human entity. So there are many places to draw the line. Some people think all living things deserve moral consideration. Some people think only certain types do. This might be dependent on the idea that those entities have interests of some kind. So maybe a tree has an interest in growing to maturity and reproducing and doing all that stuff that trees normally do when they're healthy. But let's put all that aside and just notice for now that there seems to be a big difference, and there certainly is at the theoretical level, between people who limit moral standing just to humans alone and those who see it as expanding beyond humans, possibly including all living things or even more potentially. You might think that this would lead to various problems when it comes to environmental policy making. So you might think, well, it's hard enough to try and think about what the right thing to do is when it comes to climate change or passing laws about air pollution or enforcing protection of natural landscapes, things like that. And I think when we're just considering human beings and what's good for humans and what's right with respect to humans, it's hard enough to figure out what the best policies are. But if you add into that the further controversy about whether non-humans should have their interests or other considerations brought into our deliberations as well, you might think that makes things even messier. That throws quite a big wrench into the entire deliberation process about what the best environmental policy would be, or at least what a permissible one would be. So that certainly seems plausible at first glance, right? You might think, well, what's good for humans and what's good for non-humans is not always going to harmonize. You might think sometimes, well, it's good for us to maybe build this this vast agricultural project that requires us to tear down a bunch of trees and cause damage to ecosystems. It's good for us because we produce food and it creates jobs, things like that. But it's bad for the animals and the plants that are affected by that, right? The ones that are destroyed, their habitats are ruined, and so on. So Norton's view is interesting because he says, despite what might appear to be the case at first glance, it's actually the case that the interests of humans and non-humans ultimately will be the same or very similar in terms of what policies we ought to adopt. And the reason for this is that he thinks if we take a long-term view, which we should on his view, because future humans will be affected by our decisions today. Just think of decisions about climate change, for example. He thinks things that tend to be bad for non-human nature will also be bad for us, maybe not immediately, but sooner or later. So at least in the long run, emitting fossil fuels at a high rate, which we've been doing for quite a while now. If we keep doing that, it could potentially, for some people, bring some short-term benefits. That's becoming less and less the case, but it still is the case in some situations that, well, maybe building this power plant and burning some more fossil fuels, yeah, it's bad for the environment. But it creates some jobs, it creates some wealth for people that are already pretty wealthy, but it's a marginal increase to their well-being, perhaps. You might think, well, it's good for us, bad for nature. But Norton would point out that, well, it's bad for us too in the long run, right? Because climate change isn't going to affect just non-humans. It's also going to affect us in negative ways, and of course it already is. So if we have to ask, what should we do? Should we adopt a policy that tries to convert human society to renewable forms of energy and reduces the severity of climate change in the future? Or do we double down on fossil fuels and continue to burn those? Well, if we take the latter approach, there might be some short-term benefits, but in the long run, it's going to exacerbate a problem that could be very, very bad for human beings. Climate change will kill a lot of us and harm a lot of us in various ways. So Norton thinks if we're being responsible, right, if we consider what's right to do, ethically speaking, for human beings, we will cut our emissions now in the near term. Even if that requires some sacrifice for some people, again, that's maybe less and less the case, but if it does require some sacrifice for people in the short term, well, we're nonetheless required to do that in some cases because the alternative is to do something that's good for us in the short term, but potentially catastrophic and at least very damaging to human beings that will live in the future. So that's what's called an anthropocentric argument for why we should get serious about reducing the risks of climate change. Anthropocentric because it's focused just on what's good for humans. So anthropos meaning human. If you take a non-anthropocentric point of view, there are also reasons to address climate change. It's going to be bad for non-humans in various ways. So with a quickly changing climate, that leads to impacts on habitats for non-human species. Some of them may not be able to adapt quickly enough to survive a warming world. It's going to create all sorts of problems related to climate change, or at least the cause of climate change, is ocean acidification. So our greenhouse gas emissions also lead to the acidification of the oceans, which again could be bad for humans in various ways, damaging resources, for example, but certainly will be bad for some non-human species. So it may be, again, that coral reef ecosystems won't be able to adapt quickly enough to how fast the oceans are acidifying, and many of those species may go extinct, or if not, many of their members may die off. So populations of those non-human species could become greatly decreased. So that's a reason, if you're a non-anthropocentrist who cares about those non-human creatures, that's a reason for you also to be worried about climate change and to do something in the near term to try and address it. Again, even if that means some burdens on us in the short term. So you can see where this is going with an example like this. Norton can argue, well, look, whether you're an anthropocentrist or you're a non-anthropocentrist, you have good reason to promote the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions sooner rather than later. We should get very serious about action to fight climate change, because if we don't, that's going to be very bad for humans, most likely, and it will also very likely be bad for non-humans. So what's the right thing to do? Well, Norton says we don't have to settle the complicated and highly detailed debates at the theoretical level between anthropocentrists and non-anthropocentrists, people who think only humans have moral standing versus those who think some non-humans also have moral standing. We don't need to resolve that, because in many cases, at least, the convergence hypothesis predicts, the policy recommendations of a non-anthropocentric view and those of an anthropocentric view will tend to converge and often be effectively the same. So if that's true, then that's useful. That's good to know, because it means that from a practical point of view, we don't have to wait for theory to try and solve these problems, which may never happen. There's no sign of it being resolved anytime soon. There's reasonable arguments to be had there. So if we don't need to wait for those theoretical disputes to be resolved, we can just proceed with doing what is going to be right regardless of the correct theory. So maybe anthropocentrism turns out to be false. Well, that's interesting theoretically. It's interesting to philosophers and people who have an interest in the subject. But from a policymaking point of view, it would be really unfortunate if we needed to solve all of those difficult problems before we proceeded to make our policies. So Norton thinks, from an environmental point of view, we pretty much know what the right thing to do is, because we know what's right for humans, and that will also, in the long run, tend to be what's right for non-humans as well, if it turns out that non-humans have moral standing. So either way, it doesn't matter. Just proceed with the right sorts of environmental policies, the ones that would be favored by pretty much any ethical view, and then you're good from a practical point of view, at least. So the question is the convergence hypothesis actually true? And a few things to mention when it comes to evaluating this. First of all, appreciate that it is a hypothesis, so it's not a statement of universal principle. So at least in most versions of the formulation, Norton does not claim that it's absolutely true that 100% of the time the interests of humans and non-humans will always coincide. Right? There may be exceptions. There may be cases where the overlap is not exact. Nonetheless, the hypothesis predicts that there will tend to be a convergence. So a few cases to the contrary aren't enough to disprove the convergence hypothesis. It's not the sort of thing where one counterexample can can show that it's false, because it doesn't, at least in most formulations, doesn't claim that the convergence will be 100%. So say it's 99% or something like that. Well, that's still pretty good. It's good enough for policy making. So you can still proceed without too much worry about messing things up. There are all sorts of other complications, of course, but leave those aside. Another thing to notice is that as a hypothesis, the only way to test it is to try it out and to see if it holds true. Now, Norton can point to a bunch of examples. Climate change would be one, air pollution, water pollution, things like that, where you can see, yeah, some of these things pretty clearly seem bad for human health, and they're also bad for the native species that are affected by those forms of pollution. So, the question is, and all that can show whether this is true or not is experience. The question is, will the convergence hypothesis continue to hold true in the future? And you might also look backwards and ask, has it held true in the past? And if you're a critic of the convergence hypothesis, if you don't think it quite works out, then you would need to come up with not just a couple examples, but a number of examples, or show some deeper problem in the thought behind the convergence hypothesis. Okay, so that's just a brief overview of one important concept, one important idea in environmental philosophy, the idea of the convergence hypothesis. Hope that was helpful. Talk to you soon.